We're going to turn now to the topic of university spin-out companies. Why would a research institution or a university spin out a company? Well, if you remember, we talked about bridging the gap between academia and university and industries, between university and industries. This is one of the ways that that gap can be bridged. Typically, a spin-out company might be used when there is a very large commercial opportunity. Maybe there are gains that are greater than pure license fees. I should say that a spin-out company, there's lots of different ways to transfer the IP. It can be through licensing, but when I talk about the gains greater than license fees, I mean it's better to license a company for the exclusive use and have ownership in that company than license an existing business. So sometimes it's easier and better to do it with a spin-out company. Sometimes there is very unique, very compelling research, which you don't want to give away all of the commercial gains to a private sector institution. Perhaps there are multiple products or multiple sectors that are opportunities. And maybe this is something which can give the university a big reputational gain. It's certainly a way of incentivizing researchers who can own and have part of the company. So you can see the pros and the cons on this slide. Some of them are financial, some of them are about reputation, some of them are control. But against that, there are some downsides. The university will have to invest some money to support the startup, the spin out. There will be a lot of resources and time spent by university staff. You will need external support. And of course, there's a risk of failure, but you will see that that is not as high as you might think. This is some research on UK university spin-outs. There have been over 3,000 of them in the last nearly 20 years. What we find also is that in recent years, the investment by universities is growing in the UK. But the payouts, the paybacks they're getting are big. So these are proving to be very good investments. Research by a third party called Anderson found that 9 out of 10 spin-outs survive more than 5 years. That is more than the rate of private sector startups. So as a category of startups, university spin-outs are more successful. And the most famous one of all in the UK, Arm Holdings, which is now a major smartphone chip designer, began as a Cambridge University spin-out. It's a recent transaction with SoftBank valued at £24 billion. So that's one of the most famous ones in the world. So let's talk about where we start, because we're going to need to think about a lot of things. If we're in the TTO or an education or institution's commercialization department, depending on your structure. But if I say TTO, you know that I mean either of those. We're going to ask a lot of questions before we can set up a spin-out company. First question is, we've got some research. What is the product? What is it that we're going to turn this into as a commercial product? But more than that, what does it do? What is the differentiated benefit? Where's the hole in the market that this is filling? We don't want to spend a lot of money creating a product that already exists. You're also going to want to know if there's some market validation of this. Is there some way that we can prove that the market wants this product? If you remember the robot I talked about at the beginning that was used for sniffing nuclear radioactivity, that was validated through a UK government exercise. And then was proven to be something that they could commercialize. A lot of resources are going to be needed to set up a spin-out company. You're going to need contacts in the industry in question. Maybe the researchers come from that industry. That's sometimes the case. You might need certain technical expertise in how to manufacture a product. You're going to need business contacts, all kinds of connections to be able to set up this kind of company, which a university doesn't normally have. We're going to need to put some money behind a proof of concept. Now, normally a university TTO will have a fund set up to run its spin outs, and they will use some of that fund for the proof of concept to take the research, do some IP analysis, some market analysis, etc., etc. Some of the steps that I've described in this slide. Market intelligence. Do you have any customers or potential customers? Are there also partners, research and funding partners involved? Because they might own some of the IP. And then, of course, the question I mentioned earlier, are we selling the IP or are we licensing the IP? Now, some countries allow the universities to sell their IP, and some countries do not. It has to be a license. So it varies depending on the country. Internationally, there is a slight disadvantage if you're only able to license the IP, but well, it's not a huge disadvantage, but if another country is selling IP, investors prefer sold IP because you own it outright, but it's a small issue. We've talked about TTOs and some of the partnerships they need. This is some of the specific partners that are going to be necessary for a spin out. So we've talked about filing the IP. So let's start with IP law firms. So we're going to need someone to help file the patent or give us some advice on the trade secrets and the copyright. We're going to need some business tools. We need to know perhaps might need to do a patent mapping search to see who else has got patents or technology in this area. We might need to do some kind of technology evaluation to see what applications this technology has got. Maybe it has multiple applications. Which one will be the core business area? We're going to need some business advisors that help us figure out how to go to market. Maybe we'll need someone to do some market research. We're then going to need finance. Now, I've put angels and VCs in the bottom box. However, there's a lot more than that, and I've got a special slide on finance, which I'll come to. A common thing in the UK is business incubators. Now, these are essentially offices for startups, and a business that's a startup or a spin out, before it's fully functional, can work inside an incubator, a shared office. Sometimes they will be owned by venture capitalists. Sometimes they will have IP firms allocated and paid for and other business tools available or reduced costs. So they're very good for small startups like spin-outs to get going in business. Industry partners. Possibly this research comes from the fact that your institution is already working with other industry partners. Funding partners. Probably you have other people funding parts of the research. And lastly, some TTOs have got enough spin-outs that they run a venture program. So a few projects from the research are put in through the venture program, a little bit of investment is undertaken, and then through that, all the processes in that program, that leads to the spin-out being taken into the market. So this is obviously a lot of different partners and people you'll need to work with, but this is how a TTO should think about all the different people that it needs to plan to have relationships with. And I'll talk a bit about that towards the end in another slide. So what is the university's interest? So once the company is set up, the university will own some of the company. But before that, the university has invested in the research, the physical R&D, the initial intellectual property, the first patents may be filed. Maybe there's a concept development, and maybe there's some other things that have been done by the university, prepared a business plan and so on. All of that can then be licensed into the spin-out company. And it's a private limited company. It has shares, and the university becomes an investor in the spin-out company by owning shares, by owning the equity. For example, maybe the university owns 40% or 50% or something of all of the shares in the company, and that is valued at a valuation that is made at the time of the company, so the university knows the value of its shares, and that then is crystallized. The value of the university's R&D and IP assets are all crystallized. Sometimes there might be some ongoing payments, but usually not. I mean, possibly there might be ongoing research, but usually once a spin-out company is set up, it has to stand alone. The university might have a seat on the board of directors if it's large enough and it's a significant enough investment, and that's common with any major investor. It probably won't keep that forever, but for a short time it might do. Of course, the university is losing potentially a key researcher or a team. So that's something else that has to be compensated for. There might be some value in that gets allocated, or the university might say this is a gain in marketing and reputation, which helps attract future researchers to join us. It helps attract funding. It helps attract smart people into the research functions in the university, and undergraduates even. Some of the most famous universities in the UK on the sciences side are very popular with undergraduates because they can go on into postgraduate research, and that can take them into this kind of area. The inventor or the lead researcher will also have an interest. He will often be involved in creating, or she will often be involved in creating the business plan. Typically, he or she is going to leave the university and join the startup. Now, some join full-time and some join part-time. It does vary. They are usually, but not always, going to be granted shares. That's the reason they would do this, so that they become an owner of the company. Very likely there'll be a director because they are the most senior expert with understanding of the technology. And they often take a leading role in the business in the early days. Generally, they tend to focus more on the scientific development later on, because you would typically hire sales, marketing, production, operations, professional managers to come into those areas of the business. But one area that the inventor is often involved in is investor relations, because investors love to hear from the lead science person. Now, one area you do have to avoid is conflicts of interest. How can they happen? Well, firstly, there might be conflicts between the subject matter that's spun out into the company and the university's future research. And you'll want to avoid that by having contracts in place saying that this company will not compete with the university's research. They might even come back for further research. So there's that area of the company. Then you've got the researchers, especially if they are only part-time in the spin-out company. Then they are continuing to do research at the university. If it's the same subject, it also creates a conflict risk. So we have to be very careful to make sure that this is discussed between the people, and that there's a very clear understanding that there should be no conflicts, and that those should be reported and dealt with a discussion. Okay, there aren't so many disputes per se. Not many legal disputes happen, but there are problems if the university is worried that the researcher is disclosing information from his other research into the company, or vice versa. So we have to clearly delineate that and make sure that everyone is clear. So in the UK, the average time for a spin out to get into independent operation is about 2 years. There are 3 phases. The first phase is the bit within the university and the TTO, where you have the R&D, the IP creation, the business plan, the business proposition, and the initial preparation work. That's funded by the university and dealt with mainly by the TTO. Then you have this halfway stage when the company is set up. It's in incubation phase. Maybe there's some initial investment, the first, maybe an angel investor or some seed funding from the university or another source is provided. It starts to set up. Maybe it's in a business incubator, but it's not quite operating on its own. And eventually it moves to an independent setup once revenue starts to come in or more investors come in, and then it has an independent function and operation. At that point, it is no longer dependent on the university. That takes typically 2 years. So let's talk about the setup stage. So, of course, we've been through the process of identifying the opportunity with the TTO and securing the university's agreement in principle. That's the starting point. That's all been done. The previous slide was really all about the previous, but one slide was really all about that. Then we get to forming the company. So the company needs to be formed. The shareholders, there'll be a contract with the university called a shareholders agreement and with the lead researcher, which assigns the value to the shares, sets out who's going to be on the board, how they're going to run the company, etc. The IP package, the patents, certainly the trade secrets, potentially copyright and other IP should be considered. That all needs to be assigned or licensed into the new company. There will be a process of due diligence going on, sometimes started beforehand, sometimes continuing, searches, freedom to operate, which means checking that you are able to use this technology in the market, the business plan, further market research, appoint the directors, and any third-party managers that are going to run the company. Sometimes independent people come in. Then as you grow, you recruit the team, the employees that are going to work for the company. You'll need someone dealing with the finance and accounting firm. Possibly tax issues need to be considered. And of course, very important, attract investors. We'll talk about those in a moment. There's lots of different types of investors. Eventually, we'll want to plan the exit for the university. How is it going to recoup its investment by selling out the shares? Usually that's done in phases, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The link here is to the Edinburgh University in Scotland's spin-out guide, so you can read that, and that will give you a lot more information than this slide. ICIS Innovation at the University of Oxford has been tremendously successful with spin-outs. They've had 79 spin-outs with over £500 million of investment. Now, I wanted to show a few different things here. These diagrams show some of the tools that they use. The first is funding. So they have numerous different funding sources actually connected with the TTO, ICIS. They have the University of Oxford ICIS Fund, which is funded by the university, but is managed by a professional investor. So it's not the TTO that runs that. That is essentially a professional venture capital company, but run by the university. It creates and makes its investments, and it has to make a return because it's managed professionally. So then it will continue to be successful. And so they invest in startups from the university's spin-outs. You've got the original university fund. You've got Oxford Invention Fund, which is funded by third parties, people who probably used to go to Oxford, so alumni. They often put money in, and they use it to fund more spin-outs from the university. And then you have what's called an angels network, where they have 200 investors on their books who are angels. They are the first major investor. I'll talk a bit about them in a moment. And they run a network. The TTO has a program to talk to these angels, promote to them, and they make money because they invest in these very successful startups. The university also, through ICIS, has a very established process for how It operates the spin-out company. The diagram in the top right shows that. The bottom right also shows the number of incubators and science parks around the university. Some of them are actually organized in partnership with the university, and some of them are completely independent third-party ones. But you can see that there are huge numbers around one university. Many, many spin-outs go into those organizations to start off. So that will give you an idea about very much how ISIS in Oxford actually manages its spin-outs. So looking at a case study, this is an Oxford University technology, a molecule sensing system. Originally, the research wasn't from the UK, but so this is follow-on research, applied research, you might call it, which was the first to develop a product. 3 professors left the university in 2005. They obtained funding from a venture capital group called the IP Group. I'll talk about them in a moment. It took them 9 years to launch the first product, which are DNA and RNA sequencing devices, and they have multiple products on sale now. A large number of patents. It's now become a global business and has even been used to detect COVID variants. So a very simple example of research that was taken straight into the market. It was already at a level of applied phase, which is obviously very good for commercialization. And of course, the university has made a lot of money selling its shares, or rather ISIS, which is the TTO and usually owns the shares. It has obviously made the money and repaid the university. IP. So I've mentioned patents and trade secrets and copyrights. Those are typically the critical ones that will be funded before the spin out takes place. The university will typically have to pay for that. Okay, so the first patents will get filed, trade secrets will be protected, there'll be non-disclosure agreements and other agreements around the trade secrets. And then for the copyright, particularly copyright's very common with software nowadays. Because so many technology institutes have software creations. So there'll be contracts to deal with there, licenses and assignments, which then have to be put into the spin-out company. And then once the company has been spun out, there will then need to be a number of other steps, particularly trademarks. You usually will see each company has its own name, but also then a lot of work on the contracts. The NDAs need to be executed with the company. Perhaps there's exclusivity agreements with partners or partnership agreements for continued research and development, funding agreements. There'll be a lot of contracts involved. Now, at that point, the spin-out company is usually standing on its own 2 feet if it has funding. If it doesn't, then it might need the TTO to support it. And that means the TTO's legal team and resources will be used. Or once the spin-out has enough income or investment to do this, then it can stand on its own 2 feet and get its own advisors. It's very common to ask the venture capitalists to pay for all of this. They understand that, and I've done many presentations to venture capitalists for startups saying we need some money to spend on the IP because that will increase the value of the company. Another case study, this one, I'm just going to move the slide forward to the Vietnamese language. There we go. So this one is another Oxford one, Oxford Catalysts. The research took quite a long time to come to fruition throughout the 1990s. It started with some initial research, which showed promise, then advanced research with a much larger team. Then there was a discussion with the TTO, and they realized that the research, which relates to catalysts, had energy efficiency potential. So the TTO, ISIS, then filed patents in 2000. They then formed the spin-out company in 2004. It was their 55th out of the 70 or 80 they've had. They then went out to the venture capital market and raised funding a year later. So they had some initial funding from the university and probably some grants, and then they went to the venture capital market after that. Then they raised funding through a public listing on the AIM market, which is the AIM is a subsidiary market of the main stock market, and eventually they listed on the main stock market. So it became a public company with a 90 million euro valuation. Later on, it merged with another company, changed its name to Velocis, and is now a public company with a combination of the existing company that they merged with and the Oxford Catalyst business, all in one much larger business. Another Oxford example, Oxford Vax Medics. This is a spin out from 2012. This one is interesting because I talked about research, collaboration, and partnerships earlier on. Now, the researcher, Dr. Shisong Jiang, is Chinese originally. He was working at Oxford University, but he then joined the spin-out as the lead researcher as their chief technical officer. Essentially, this spin-out created a platform to develop cancer vaccines, as well as other cancer-related tools. Because he came from China originally, he had connections in China. He came from an industry and a background which gave him all these connections, which enabled him to partner with a Hong Kong company, which then established a facility in China, in Changzhou, and then they were able to attract quite a large amount of money from a South Korean cancer pharmaceutical company. Now they have cancer vaccines going into phase 1 clinical trials, phase 1 trials, and then there are 2 cancer vaccines that are going into that phase. This is interesting because it shows how international a spin-out company can be. We don't need to think locally. You can think big. Financing. This is very important. Financing for spin-out companies is something we need to have a good understanding of, because there are lots of different segments to the finance market. Typically, the first step is seed funding from the university, because they've already paid for the R&D and the IP, and they need to pay to set up the company. Sometimes money is available immediately, but more often than not, there's a bridging period before venture capital can be raised, when the university might need to put some more money in. However, that's not the only source of money.
Hi, Nick. We haven't been able to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Your voice is...
Let me turn my microphone up. Is that louder?
Yeah, it's okay now. Interpreter, can you hear Nick clearly?
Yes,
thì có anh đã nghe được Nick chưa ạ?
Great.
Yeah, but
okay,
we
I'll
just
talk.
lost you a few seconds before.
Let me start again on this
It's okay
slide.
now.
Yes, okay.
So the initial funding typically will come from the university, because they want to develop their investment in the spin-out company. But a second stage is to go to seek grants from other sources. Grants might be available from other public sources, and certainly in the UK there are a number of foundations which are connected with industrial companies. They're essentially charities set up by companies, because there are tax benefits of that, and those grants can be available for spin-out companies. There are other funding sources available once you set up the company, and those can include local and regional government support, because a spin-out company is a startup, and local governments often have some funding for startups, or regional governments. It's very common in China. There might be co-funding available for people in the same industry that would like to work with this startup. And then once you put the startup into an incubator or a science park, then there might be some financial support there. It might not be cash, but it might be low rent or IT support or IP advisors, business advisors. There's lots of ways through incubators and startups, science parks and accelerators to get funding. It's usual at that stage to then start looking for a large funder, and you'll start with angel investors. Now, angel investors are usually rich individuals who have an interest in the sector and want to invest in a startup. They're not quite the same as venture capitalists, but they're normally the step before a venture capital business comes in. Now, in the UK, we have got a lot of specialist venture capitalist investors that exclusively invest in university spinouts. I'll talk about that in a moment. So you might not always go through these steps in the UK, but in many other countries, this is how you would go through all of the funding steps and try and work out how to arrange enough money to get this startup through that first and second phase to be a standalone business. On average in the UK, £4 million is raised by a university spin-out, typically over several rounds of funding. So there might be some initial seed funding, angel, venture capital round A, venture capital round B. They're called series, Series A and Series B and Series C. So the university, it typically, let's say it owns 40% of the spin-out. When the venture capitalist comes in, they might sell some of their shares if they wanted to take some money out because the value has gone up by now. At the Series B, maybe they'll sell some more out to the venture capitalist. And then later on, they may keep some right up to the IPO or other exit. And that can mean that the university can raise quite a lot of money over a long period of time, and each amount gets bigger as the value of the company rises. And in the slide here, there are multiple different sources of funding, and you can see that the universities typically own 37% of a company, or provide 37% of the financing of a company. Venture capitalists, angels, and so on provide the rest. I mentioned that specialist venture capitalists exist in the UK. This is two examples. They are often located near key universities. So the one on the left, Oxford Science Innovation, is a company which specializes in bringing spin-outs from Oxford University exclusively, just one focus. And they take as many as they can get. And obviously their job then is to help invest in the company, raise more money, and make sure it gets through to a hugely successful exit in years to come. They focus on 4 science areas, and OSI is quite well known. If you're a professor in the university in Oxford, you go to your TTO, and then almost certainly you'll be doing a presentation to OSI at some point to say, will you give me some funding? IP Group is a much bigger organization. This is a public listed company. It's listed on the London stock market because it's so big, and it specializes in all British universities in 3 technology areas: environmental, life sciences, and deep technology. And so they talk to all the TTOs. They've got their favorite ones, their preferred ones. Obviously, universities with environmental technology will be one group of them, and their goal is to build successful companies out of these spin-out companies. These are so specialist, they have support networks. They can give you the IP advice, or they can source the business advice you need. They've probably been through it before with another spin-out. So they're very, very specialized and very experienced at this. So let's look at some processes for Vietnamese TTOs to look at. Well, we need to start with getting your expertise to the highest level possible. The more you can learn about this process of spin-outs, the better. I don't know if there are networks of TTOs with spin-out expertise or experience. I don't know if there's a TTO organization, an association of TTOs in Vietnam. There certainly are some international ones, and using those kind of networks, creating conferences, creating events, having speakers. Of course, there'll be WIPO and other projects like this. The more expertise you can get, the better. And in some of those subject areas, how to set up a company, how to do contracts, you can use the WIPO sample templates. That's a good place to get contracts from. So if there's a national infrastructure, that's great. Building the processes to select the spin-outs and going through that early stage analysis is something that you'll need to do. And a TTO officer is therefore, as Yen's slides showed, her presentation showed, is a jack of all trades. They have to do a bit of everything, from analyzing the research through to business plans, through to marketing, through to finance, and so on. The university will almost certainly need to have some kind of funding in place so that it can fund spin-outs, at least the first stage, the seed funding, to get the company set up and initially running. Whether it has its own budget or it has an outside source of funds will be something that each university will need to work out. You will need to have a network of people to work with, financial partners, business advisors in your region. And at the bottom of this slide, I've put a list of half a dozen venture capital organizations in Vietnam. So if you haven't got these networks to you, then you should reach out to them and say that you're a TTO, that you're building spin-out companies, and you want to help build your network of venture capital interested venture capitalists as part of that. Now, they might have local people in your area. It might be easier if they are local to you. So in each city, it might be ideal to find out who has access to this kind of finance. The business advisors, consultants, IP firms, business parks in your town, and incubators. If you don't have a network with those, then you would want to build up a network because, as I said before, university spin-outs are often the most successful startups. And successful startups usually return money to the incubators, and the incubators like it. Science parks like having successful companies because they grow and they obviously earn more money from that. And then certain universities might become centers of excellence. There might be some universities that have more spin-out companies, and those ones can teach the other universities. Oxford is one of the most famous ones in the UK. ISIS Innovations, its TTO, spends a huge amount of time talking at conferences, spreading the knowledge about how it does this to other universities so they can create successful spin-out companies. And then, if you haven't ever had a spin-out company, at some point you're going to have to take a risk and try and find a test case to start out. So I hope that was useful.